Welcome to the Inclusive Growth Show with Toby Mildon. Future-proofing your business by creating a diverse workplace.
Hey there, thank you ever so much for tuning into this episode of the Inclusive Growth Podcast. I'm Toby Mildon, and today I'm joined by Aaron Barnes. Aaron has got loads of experience working in senior leadership teams at Parcelforce, as one organisation, for example. Now he works as an operational excellence and leadership development consultant. And we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion because when he was working at Parcelforce, he was really instrumental in addressing gender diversity within the organisation. So going to catch up with Aaron to learn what he learnt and hopefully apply some principles to your own organisation. So Aaron, thanks ever so much for joining me today. It's lovely to see you.
Thanks, Toby. Been really looking forward to the pod and the opportunity to share my experience.
So that was a really brief, high-level introduction to yourself, but can you just share with us a bit more about your background and what inspired you to focus on gender diversity during your time at Parcelforce?
Yeah, with pleasure. Thank you. So my diversity background, I'll talk about career first. So briefly, my background is 18 years of leadership in operations, commercial and operational excellence roles at Royal Mail. And that culminated, as you touched on, in me being the Managing Director of Parcelforce Worldwide, which is Royal Mail's express parcels business. Recently, I've set up my own consultancy, and that specialises in operational excellence and leadership development. And just to add for context, in the early days of my career, like right at the very beginning for Royal Mail, I combined, as many graduates do, a strong work ethic with a love of learning and personal development. And that saw me progress at, a good pace. And then as my roles included more accountability for people and team leadership, I discovered a passion and developed a skill for shaping those teams, for fostering the right culture and embracing development. And it really all became about the people plan. So you asked what inspired me to focus on gender diversity. When I started as the MD in Parcelforce, it's a significant sized business. It's over £1 billion of annual revenue. And I was tasked with a strategy, or to develop the strategy, to grow the business, monstrously grow it, so over double the revenues. So the strategy was a growth strategy, a really significant one too. And do you know what scared me the most about that task? It wasn't that it hadn't been done before. It wasn't that it was my first MD role, although that was certainly daunting in its own right. It wasn't anything like that. It was the lack of diversity amongst the senior leadership team and the risk that represented to the achievement of the strategy. And just to build, I looked at the operational leadership team. When I'm saying that, I'm really focused on the operational leadership team. They're the nucleus of the organisation, and there just wasn't any diversity. Look, I don't know why, but what struck me most about the lack of diversity was that there wasn't a single woman, and I just found that troubling. And how could we change on the scale that we needed to change with such little diversity? It unsettled me. And I'll just build on that in the answers to the question. I described the paradigm at the time in the business as like a security in the status quo, which isn't unique to Parcelforce. And I think the absence of diversity at that time in the management team was one of the mechanisms that preserved the status quo. So I came into the business. One of my sort of vantage points coming into Parcelforce was that I was like this outside insider. I'd come from Royal Mail into Parcelforce. I could draw upon what I'd seen in Royal Mail, and it must be said, Royal Mail have made excellent progress on DEI from the top down. particularly on gender diversity, which is perhaps part of what made it stand out even more to me in Parcelforce. Now, Parcelforce hadn't, it seemed, been touched by any of that. Or maybe it hadn't sustained or reversed out, because I can't really comment on what had happened prior to my arrival, but it was just really clear. It's a big difference, big difference. So the catalyst for this focus on gender diversity, to come back to your question, Toby, was based on that initial assessment for the business's readiness to change and on the scale it needed to change. And to me, the absence of diverse leadership was, one, a moral and ethical concern, and two, it represented a very real risk to our ability to transform.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you said that, because with many of my clients, I talk about the business case of diversity and inclusion and how it helps us create higher performing teams. And we need to link it back to business objectives around growth, for example, and things like that. So as you were sort of getting started on your journey, what were some of the steps or initiatives that you took to address diversity, and what did you find were the most impactful?
Yeah, so I'll start with like the state of gender diversity when I sort of began, and then move on to actions that were taken. So first of all, there's a very clear glass ceiling at depot manager level. There were no women beyond that. It was fixed, and the disparity didn't end there, though. So, like, the chronology of this for me was that those observations, and then sort of overturning stones, and it reinforcing the fact that something needed to be done. And one of those key moments for me came when the business's annual engagement survey got published. And this, in Royal Mail, as it is in many organisations, was really high profile. It mattered to the business. It mattered to me enormously. So I'm poring over the results, as you do, and trying to make sense of them. Now, I know, and it's interesting to note, that in engagement surveys, women tend to answer more positively than men. So you should expect to see, say, higher engagement amongst female employees compared to male employees, for example. And you could see that in my business's overall results. Women were more engaged and they had higher trust than their male counterparts. Shockingly, though, when I filtered it by managers, a huge gap jumped off the page. Women managers, for reasons I didn't understand at that point, were considerably less engaged and had considerably lower trust than their male counterparts. And so my discomfort increased tenfold. I just had to take action. It's no longer this initial observation. It starts to gain real validity in my mind, even more so. So steps that I took initially, there were a couple of distinct phases that actually ran in parallel with, at the time it's just circumstance. I was studying for my MBA at the time as well, with Henley Business School, which, as a side note, was a personally amazing experience. And I got to a reputation and responsibility module, as it was called. And interestingly, you could focus on internal reputation as well as external, or instead of external reputation. So it was about both. And so I took the opportunity to understand this diversity problem in more detail, arranged one-to-ones with every female depot manager in the business. There were only 9, so this isn't an enormous endeavour. Less than 20% of all of our depot managers. And those conversations were interesting. They were really interesting, but they barely scratched the surface. One theme that I was curious about, and it struck me at the time, was that there wasn't any immediate reinforcement from those women about the survey results, the engagement survey results. There was just maybe more surprise and pondering from them. We may come back to that later in our conversation. But as I said, it felt like I barely scratched the surface with those discussions, but it did prompt me as sort of the first action that I took to establish a Women in Parcelforce Employee Resource Group, ERG, in the business. And through that, we then continued the conversations. It was a lovely way for me to sort of like satisfy that need to do more and build on those initial conversations, which felt rather limited for my initial assignments. And it started to build an agenda and to make a difference. And I think the standout achievement during that phase of the ERG, because it evolved and started to become really quite impactful, was we did a Women in Parcelforce comms campaign. And it was focused on increasing the visibility of women that we did have in the business at that time. And one of my fantastic female colleagues at the time, it was the first time I'd heard it, but I've heard it many times since. She said to me, "You cannot be what you cannot see." And so this campaign was focused on increasing the visibility of and awareness of the few women we did have in leadership positions in the business. I'd still categorize depot manager as a leader in the business. They're running businesses. And it took the team out of their comfort zone with pieces to camera. We put it out over internal channels as a bit of a series. Toby, look, I know it takes a lot of courage to really do that sort of thing, to put yourself out there. But the team understood why that was necessary. And so they put their discomfort to the side, and it got a great reaction. Like, it just did the trick. Now, I had to gently push that campaign and give it some encouragement to get it going and built. But one beautiful moment further down the line, as we were really motoring, was that some of the senior male managers in the business actually did a equivalent campaign focused on allyship. And I tell you, those videos were so powerful. All of them were, on both the initial campaign and this follow-up campaign. It was just such a great build, though, that allyship was. And evidence to me of progress, in part because the allyship concept and campaign came without any impetus from me. Like, I'm not claiming credit for that, so I'm not that sort of person anyway. But the operations team were engaged, the HR team were engaged, the comms team were engaged, and the effort had really started to become more autonomous via and around the ERG, which is just, it was so great to see. So, no, the initial progress and impact, but just the start.
It's really interesting what you were saying about how women tend to be more positive in engagement surveys. I think that's something worth remembering, because it kind of skews your insights slightly. And it's not something I'd really heard of before. I always say to my clients that if you are doing engagement surveys or diversity and inclusion surveys, for example, don't just take the high level or the top level results, because you are hearing from the majority voice. And so it's going to be skewed. You do need to break it down into different cohorts so that you can compare, for example, the experience between men and women, or between disabled colleagues and non-disabled colleagues, or people from an ethnic minority background versus not an ethnic minority background, which is interesting. And something else that interested me, what you were saying, is that you held those one-to-one meetings with those 9 women depot managers, and nothing really jumped out at the page, it sounded like. Why do you think that was, even though there was the data suggesting that they weren't as engaged?
Well, yeah, so first of all, the point around the skew in engagement surveys, it to me, knowing that those sorts of dynamics existed that influenced the data, it made the gap that I saw amongst managers even greater. Yeah, so there's even bigger gap than it's materially saying on from the survey. Secondly, what I came to learn is that gender bias isn't something that is gendered. So female employees are influenced by those biases. Yeah, so this is a very male-dominated environment. Operations is typically. So anyway, so again, it's not a unique Royal Mail and Parcelforce thing. So it sort of started to accept the status quo. So yeah, we went on to go and challenge it. But part of the insights I gained through further research and the subsequent action plan reinforces that perhaps women and men are experiencing and subject to the same biases as in many respects. That's my take on that. We can perhaps build on it as we continue the story of the journey.
If you're enjoying this episode and looking to boost equity, inclusion and diversity in your organisation, Toby and his team are here to help you. The team specialises in crafting data-driven strategies, developing inclusive leaders, designing fair recruitment processes, and enhancing disability confidence. With a blend of professional expertise and lived experience, we are ready to support you on your journey. Reach out to us through our website at mildon.co.uk. Now, back to the interview with Toby and his guest.
So as you were going on your journey, what were some of the challenges or resistance that you faced, and how did you overcome these obstacles?
Well, yeah, so great question. The biggest challenge is one that still, in truth, plays on my mind today. So I'm not sure it's really properly settled in my mind and fully processed. And the biggest challenge, without being too melodramatic, Toby, was the collateral damage. And what I mean by that is the perceived marginalisation of the male employees in the business in the process of amplifying this gender diversity agenda. I'm sure you've seen this in many different guises before. This first came to my attention to sort of expand on my learning and my experience of the challenge following the cascade of annual goals in the business. And I was really excited about this goals cascade, Toby. It's something I always took seriously anyway. Yeah, it sounds perverse, doesn't it? But I felt this. I've always felt this responsibility to provide absolute clarity to my management team about what's expected. Yeah, and I think that clarity comes in short supply, in all honesty. So I know it's a big part of the way I lead. And the problems first emerged as I enthusiastically approached the annual goals cascade. And for the first time ever in the business, I had ensured that we had SMART goals that looked to increase the proportion of female managers over the course of the year. Not just gender focused, but I must add, we had a goal of similar focus on increasing the proportion of ethnic minority managers as well. For reasons I've already touched on, that these are vital actions. I was really, really proud of this. Royal Mail had included targets in its, as it's obligated to do in its annual CSR report. And Parcelforce is part of those numbers. It always is. But it's sort of lost in the scale. You're talking 5,000, 6,000 employees up to within 130,000 employees. Parcelforce had never given profile and visibility to their DEI ambitions like this, and like I was doing through this goals cascade. Now, onto my challenge, I'd started to hear murmurs of disgruntlement from some of the male managers in the business. And, I'd get those from the managers union, who I had a really good relationship with. I'd get them from my senior leadership team. I'd get them from my HR director and my head of HR. And they were all just like FYIs. So inadvertently, it transpires, I'd created some concern amongst the male managers in the business that they were along the lines of they shouldn't apply for roles because they're destined for female managers. They're seeking out women, not men. Do they have a future in the business? In a business that's being so overt about its gender diversity direction. And as I say, I don't think I fully processed that yet. But I made a conscious decision at the time to see it as a positive signal. Sometimes you're going to create a bit of tension like that when you're looking to make a significant change. And for the record, I just wanted the best people for the roles. I just knew that the current gender split in the business wasn't reflective or representative of that. That's the start point and the end point. So that's the standout challenge and like the manifestation of resistance. And I suppose I overcame it by trusting my instincts, really, you know?
It's a really common thing. Diversity can feel quite threatening to some people because they do feel like their own job security is at risk. That something I hear quite a lot from people who don't identify as being diverse, for example, is they just say, well, I'm not diverse. I don't identify that way. But one thing that I like to talk to my clients about is that we are all diverse, that diversity is a very broad spectrum. It's not just about the 9 protected characteristics as per the Equality Act, but it could be things like whether you're introverted or extroverted, whether you grew up in the countryside or in the middle of a city, or whether you grew up in a one-parent household or multiple parent household. All of these things contribute to our lived experiences and our diversity. And I suppose where I like to get my clients thinking towards is more around creating that culture of inclusion so that we're leveling the playing field so that everyone's got an equal chance of thriving and succeeding within a business.
I love that. Yeah. So I continue to learn and really enjoy learning in this space. And I'll definitely use that. We're all diverse.
And that learning orientation is really important. It's one of the 6 inclusive leadership behaviors, that kind of growth mindset, that learning orientation. And something you've mentioned already, I don't know if it kind of stood out to you, but inclusive leaders do challenge the status quo. They do question why things are being done, and they're prepared to rock the boat, and they're prepared to be bold and stand up for what's right, which is important. So what are some of the measurable changes or successes that came out of the efforts that you implemented at Parcelforce?
Yes, so I'll just sort of build on sort of the what next, following on from the initial successes of the ERG as I answer that question, Toby. So as I've already mentioned, it felt like I just scratched the surface with that reputation and responsibility assignment for the MBA, and it gave me an opportunity to start to begin to understand the problem. But that's all. It was like a snapshot. And so when I got the chance to do my dissertation for my MBA, I wanted to use it to get into the gender diversity problem in more detail. Now, this time I got the chance for much deeper conversations. I had an academic basis from which to plan my questioning, and I was determined to come out with a coherent plan, one that would change the paradigm in the business. And I tell you, those conversations I had in those interviews were just so engaging. They were brilliant. The interviewees were brilliant, inspiring, eloquent people that, I had to listen back to the recordings to transcribe the interviews, just part of the process. But I've never actively listened so much in all my life. I just enjoyed listening back even more than the initial interviews. Just transfixed by what these women were telling me. And just to give you a flavour of that, the something I'll never forget, probably the most powerful, inspiring example from those interviews was a colleague of mine, and this was an interview. A job interview. At the time, she's in an administrative role, I think, in the depot, and she's applying to be a manager for the first time. And she shared an amazing experience with me in her interview, which she was at home and she was getting ready for the interview. And before they were leaving, they looked at themselves in a mirror by the front door, and they were dressed in trousers and a smart blouse, interview attire as far as they're concerned. And this woman looked at herself, and this person she was looking at, it wasn't her. She was dressing how she thought people would want her to look for the interview. So she promptly went and got changed into, in her words, if I recall correctly, a flowery dress and heels, like something that was much more reflective of her style and her individuality. And guess what? She got the job. The same person, actually, she shared to me another account, like just such power and confidence. And she said to me how the interviewers went into the questions about resilience. And so resilience is really important in business life and in operations in particular. I used to say that it's the most important attribute, resilience, because you are going to get knocked down and can have to get back up. And so they got to the question about resilience, and that's fine. That's not an issue. You always expect it. But they asked her this question another 2 or 3 times. She stopped them. She challenged them. She said, hold on a minute. You keep on asking me about resilience, and it's because I'm a young woman and you don't think I can stand up to the 60 blokes in the depot and hold my own. Don't judge me by how I look. And now I'm listening back to the audio, like punch in the air. Just so inspirational. There were darker points, like in the interviews, colleagues talking about it feeling like a closed club, about how it was like a club that they couldn't enter, that they didn't even think about entering anymore. And they just wouldn't entertain it, like they wouldn't be allowed to participate. One point, again, it just stopped me in my tracks. And this lady just talked about how lonely it is as a woman in the business. Now I'm getting to make sense of the engagement survey outputs, through these conversations. Just amazing. It's amazing. And there's a lot of stuff that maybe talked to a time further back in history in Royal Mail and society, reflected society at the time. Many of these interviewees had long tenure. So they also talked about how things have progressed over that time, so for the positive. But just an amazing experience doing those interviews, as I hope you can tell and hope it comes across. I honestly felt privileged to be part of those conversations, and it intensified my determination to make a change and move far beyond, as you've already echoed, that business case for change, and much more of a values-led endeavour.
The power of storytelling is really important, because you can run engagement surveys, you can get all of the data and the statistics and the charts, and you can get a few comments verbatim, but it's the real lived experience stories that bring everything to life. That's what people remember. A colleague of mine at the BBC, her job is to run workshops where people working in the BBC making programs, so producers, production managers, they get to meet real life audience members, and they get to talk to them about their lives and their consumption of BBC output. And they always say how impactful it is just sitting down and looking at people directly and hearing from them about their lives. That's much more impactful than running a survey and just reading the results. It sticks with you for a very long time.
Yeah, I won't ever forget it. You're so right. And so I synthesized those inputs now into a much more coherent action plan to continue my response to your what did I get done question. And that action plan focused on 3 areas. It focused on support, education, and recruitment. Which I know is a little different to the first 2. So if I may just expand on each of those sort of 3 areas to enrich our conversation. So support was about things like the ERG. It was about mentoring, connecting women in Parcelforce with others to create a support network. So, and that Women in Parcelforce campaign is a great example of that, yeah? So it's a sort of like facilitating connections. For mentoring, just to expand on a different point, we took a considered approach to pilot that with the ERG members initially. And we asked mentor volunteers to create like a profile, just a 1-pager about their experience, what they could bring, like for a mentee, and they'd explain who they were and what their areas of expertise were. And then the ERG members could then be quite targeted in how and who they approached to mentor them. That worked well. I like that we were considered at the start, because often with these things like mentoring schemes, Toby, they start off with all this sort of fanfare and excitement, and then they fizzle out almost straight after the initial launch. So something that my head of HR had done in a previous team that he brought into this endeavour, then I incorporated into the action plan. On to education, and we might pick up here on those initial reactions from the women depot managers that I interviewed. Yeah. So the reason this was part of the plan was to raise awareness and consciousness of the barriers affecting engagement and trust amongst women in the business, and specifically to combat what's termed second generation gender bias. Now, I wasn't familiar with that term prior to doing my MBA research, so I'll just explain what that is for anybody else listening that, like me, hadn't heard it before or was unfamiliar. To explain, first generation gender bias is overt bias. Yeah, and it might be that women aren't allowed to apply for drivers' jobs, for example. That's overt bias on the grounds of gender. Now, certainly on the surface, those types of bias are a thing of the past. They're no longer pervasive. But what is still pervasive are more latent biases. So they might be subconscious, they might be invisible, and they're certainly quite subtle at first glance. So I'll give you an example from that came up in my research, and a cluster of women managers in the business that I spoke to were in administrative managerial roles in the depots. And guess what? There aren't any administrative managerial roles in the depots. They didn't exist. There wasn't we called it a template, but there wasn't an administrative managerial role. The operational duties had been informally shifted over to the male managers, and the administrative duties had been concentrated on the one female manager in the team. As I say, this wasn't just a one-off, and it was a clear theme. Now, some people might just say that's just everybody smart. It's a way of working to people's strengths. It's to divide the workload. I think that's missing the point. What it did was it isolated the female manager. It created an us and them dynamic, and it even blocked succession pathways. So when the depot manager's off, who's going to cover for them? Like one of the operational managers or the admin manager? It's a no-brainer, isn't it? It's going to be an operational manager. So the reason I love this example is it's not just education for male employees that's required here, because women need to be aware of this bias as well. They have to raise their own awareness and take some personal accountability for how that might manifest itself. In some ways, women play a role in sustaining that bias, as I say. I have to really be clear, though, it's not women's fault. This is a reflection of societal and cultural norms. I just feel passionately that an awareness of this bias, the education action part of the plan, for all stakeholders, helps combat the effects of this sort of bias. And so we have this education strand of the action plan.
It just goes to show how pervasive and embedded bias and prejudice is within our society. It's very systemic, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, it is, yeah. But so much so that those being disadvantaged by it don't always see it, yeah? And I don't mean to patronise when I say that at all, but it's part of the answer, Toby, to your initial question, in my view, around why, even though the facts showed that their answers to the engagement survey reflected lower engagement and lower trust than their male counterparts, many of the women didn't see that. They weren't seeing it, another manifestation of second generation gender bias. So a real curiosity for me was aroused from my learning on second generation gender bias and the subsequent need for education in that area. And then recruitment, as I acknowledged, this is a different area for action. It's more specific than like these global sort of support and education action areas. But it was also the area where the most immediate changes could be affected. And the feedback from the interviews here was perhaps the most uncomfortable and deafening. It talked about old boys clubs, about closed doors, about people losing aspirational spirits because jobs were given to mates. And so it needed immediate action. And I could be quite forensic about this area. So we got to work, and two things that were really quick to do that had a significant impact. So instituting balanced assessment boards, so ensuring we had at least one female assessor for every managerial role that was being assessed for. Look, that created some initial challenges. Practically speaking, do we have enough female assessors to meet the demand? Yeah, but the HR team just got on that straight away and trained more female assessors. It's not an actual barrier, and they did a really good job doing that. We had this requisition process for managerial roles. It's just like I hate this sort of red tape personally, Toby, but an authority process that at least gave me visibility of every request that was coming through. I was like the last person in the authority chain. But what that allowed me to do at first was I'm literally scanning for it and seeing, because you have to put the name of the assessors down in the requisition. Have we got a female assessor there? If not, it goes back. And so we just start to change some behaviours that way. Lots went back initially. Maybe the message wasn't getting through. None got through without a female assessor named. And then on a similar point, I try to maximise this re-engineering of that requisition process. And probably even more significantly, it asked whether the role that you're looking to recruit into could accommodate flexibility. And the default answer was no. Nobody ever put yes, Toby. Nobody ever put yes. Hands up, myself included. So I'd done countless requisitions over my 15, 16 years prior to this point. And just the thought process is almost automatic. These are really challenging roles. There's not a moment to breathe. It can't accommodate flexibility. Now, again, from my interviews, I'm speaking to female colleagues that are telling me that a big reason for that glass ceiling is the lack of flexibility. And they're challenging me about how real that those flexibility barriers are. So we didn't have a single job share arrangement in place in the business. We didn't have a single part-time operational manager in the business. And there's no need. So there's no material reason why we didn't have those. It was just literally we didn't want the hassle as it was perceived. That was just because we didn't want to make it possible. I'm certain that if we gave the opportunity to two women to be regional leaders, which is the level above depot managers, to share that regional leader role, they'd make it work. Or it could be a man and a woman. It doesn't matter. Like the principle is the job share principle, and there's a lack of flexibility. So two foundational hygiene factors that I added to the recruitment process that made a big, big difference.
It reminds me when I was working at Deloitte, we had a similar situation where there was a glass ceiling for women at director level on their path to becoming a partner in the firm. And there was an assumption that as a director or a junior partner, you need to be incredibly responsive to clients. You need to be able to jump on a plane at a minute's notice to go and visit a client, for example. But that was all false. It was actually the lack of flexible working that was the issue. So Deloitte created a really simple, agile working policy. It was initially designed to address the gender imbalance amongst partners in the firm, but it quickly took off in the company, and we realized that actually it benefited everybody in the business, and it improved the performance of everybody across the organization. It wasn't just a gender issue.
Yeah, you've done something right when it really catches fire like that. And yeah, it's the same for this recruitment bit. It's just you knew it was the right thing to do instantly. So I changed that default to, yes, it can accommodate flexibility. It should be taken, I know, it's certainly out of my remit, to the fields in the requisition forms, but it shouldn't even be on there. So the default is yes. And tell me a situation where it is genuinely no. I welcome those conversations when we really got into it.
So how is your experience as a business leader who has really championed equity, diversity and inclusion at Parcelforce, and with a particular focus around gender equality, influenced your own values and the types of organizations that you're working with now that you're a consultant?
Yeah, so I touched on values. I'm really pleased that you've asked me about values, because I think it's my values that reinforce what led me to focus on gender diversity in Parcelforce. It wasn't just my intuition and genuine belief that we couldn't transform the business in its current state, but my values were driving me. And the lack of diversity in the business was quite simply wrong. I actually realized one day when I was preparing to open the Women in Parcelforce ERG one time, and I wanted to connect the members of the group to express why championing gender diversity really meant something to me. And it led me to my values, Toby. It led me to authenticity, integrity, trust. And looking back at those engagement survey results, the disparity in engagement and trust was just plain wrong. So it continues to influence my values, and I know it's something that I really lead on about. It's what I'm about. That essence is the type of businesses that I'm looking to work with.
So a question that I ask everybody when they come on this show is, what does inclusive growth mean to you? What key action would you like the person listening to us right now to take away?
Okay, I love that question. I've heard you ask it to other guests. And to me, inclusive growth means taking notice of these diversity, equity, and inclusion problems and doing something about it, making positive changes. And for me, that looked like championing, listening, giving a voice to something because it's the right thing to do. From my experience, I must add that it also led to, and you've touched on growth mindset, a significant amount of personal growth too. And it strikes me hearing you ask that question that I could have almost called my strategy an inclusive growth strategy. I wish I did. So my learning continues to this day.
Cool. And finally, for the person listening to us right now, if they want to learn more about what you do, perhaps they've got a question that they would like to ask you offline, what's the best way of them following you, getting in touch with you?
Yeah, so via my website, aaronbarnesconsultancy.com, and or LinkedIn. People tend to prefer to stalk people on LinkedIn these days, so feel free to come and find me there.
Brilliant. Well, Aaron, thanks ever so much for joining me on today's episode. It's been really great to catch up with you, and I find it really inspiring to actually sit down with a senior business leader who's actually implemented real change within a large organization and done so with great authenticity.
Thanks, Toby. Yeah, I mean this genuinely. I was particularly the members of that ERG in Parcelforce and the interviewees from my research so were the inspiration. So, and they continue the work to this day.
Thanks, Aaron. Hopefully we'll get to catch up soon, and good luck with working with your clients.
Thank you.
And thank you for tuning into this episode of the Inclusive Growth Podcast with myself and today's guest, Aaron Barnes. Hopefully you've been inspired by our conversation and it's given you some key actions or key principles that you can take away and start to implement in your own organization. If there's anything I can do to help you create a more inclusive culture in your business, feel free to reach out through my website, mildon.co.uk, or just get in touch with me on LinkedIn. Until next time, I look forward to seeing you on the next episode, which will be coming out very soon. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Inclusive Growth Show. For further information and resources from Toby and his team, head on over to our website at mildon.co.uk.